My name's Brandon Staub.
And I'm Brad O'Connell. Welcome to In Dispute Podcast, where we discuss hot-button issues in the Christian church. We're learning to listen to the Bible instead of our emotions, and we invite you to learn with us. Our hope is that these raw conversations would help lead us to truth and bring us closer to the mind and heart of God. Hello, everybody. Welcome to In Dispute Podcast. This is part 2 of our discussion on the topic of abortion. I mentioned in the last episode that this is probably one of the craziest, probably one of the most controversial topics that we've done so far on the podcast. Maybe the most controversial we'll ever do. Last week, just as a really quick recap, we asked that you would go back and listen to that podcast when you get a chance. Actually, if you haven't listened to it yet, we ask that you stop this podcast and go back and listen to the first one because it's an important part of the conversation. But it just as a quick recap, we talked about the importance of life, the dignity of life, where God's coming from as far as his creation. And we talked a little bit about not just the importance of life, but where life starts. What is the beginning of life? How do we define that? What does that look like from a biblical standpoint? We also brought in some science and looked at it from a scientific standpoint because we think that it's important to understand those concepts and define the importance of life and the start of life if we're even going to talk about this topic. Mm-hmm. If those two don't exist, if they don't have a baseline, then the rest of the conversation is kind of a moot point. Tonight, or today, whenever you're listening to it, we're going to start off part of this podcast. We've said this a couple different times, a couple different ways. The podcast is meant to be a conversation. So even though it's one-ended, kind of on our end, I guess, when we put this out into the interweb realm, we're hoping that people on social media that run across us would engage with us, that they would comment, that they would message us, just chat with us. We want to hear your opinions. We don't care if you disagree with us. We want to learn from your opinion. We talk about a lot of controversial things, and we want to be able to not just share the Christian standpoint, but we also, at least Brandon and I as Christians, like to be challenged on our viewpoints. We like to learn about other people's viewpoints, because what that does is it forces us to really dig into Scripture and make sure that we're believing in something that we see as truth in the Bible and not just something that's based on our opinion or based on our emotions as often as possible. Mm-hmm. And so to be fair in that realm of conversation, we wanted to start off tonight with bringing up some, just a couple, one or two arguments that the pro-choice side a lot of times brings up, kind of against the Bible, I guess, against the religious realm, why they are pro-choice, why they disagree with the Bible, what upsets them, what angers them about the Bible. And so one of the things that we have here is this concept of God, and specifically God in the Old Testament and the way that he interacted with the world. We see there are times in the Old Testament where God is killing babies or killing children or allowing them to be killed, right? He didn't step in very well when we see the Egyptian Pharaoh killing all the Hebrew boys. And then we see in retaliation to that, in a sense, we see at the very end, God killing the firstborn of the land, right? And then we see in a couple different passages this kind of thing happening. We see with Elisha, he gets made fun of by some younger people for being bald, and God has a bear come out and kill these 42 children. And those are just two ideas. And so I just want to say right off the bat, we understand why that stirs anger. We understand why that stirs question. Christians don't have 100% in stone answers to these questions. Like, it's not like Brandon and I are reading these passages that are in these arguments and we say, wow, man, God is just so awesome that he just slaughtered the firstborn of the entire land. That's pretty cool, God. Like, we don't read the scriptures like that either. And we ask the same exact questions, and we have the same struggles, and we have the same emotions that get stirred in us. We get angry at God. We question God. I mean, I read these passages, and there are times where I sit down in my car on my way to work, and I just kind of scream out to God, "What were you thinking? Why is this so difficult? Why did you go this path?" So we just want to, mention that we get it. We, at least us two, don't want to argue you in that. We don't think that that's a horrible argument to have or anything like that. And likewise, we also want to say that the research that we've done, and Brandon and I, just for our own purposes and in preparation for these episodes, have not only studied, not only prayed, but we have read commentators' opinions on these types of passages, and we honestly do not find an answer adequate enough to kind of quench our questioning, to quench our emotions that are going on as well. So even as Christians, we're kind of in that same boat. Now, there are some answers, I think, to at least those two passages that I do believe are answers, and I think are biblical answers, even though my emotions don't tend to line up with them at all times. And one of those things is that when we're talking about the topic of abortion or a similar topic, we are talking about human beings in essence becoming gods. Human beings who say, this is how I want to live, and this is why I want to live this way, and nobody else should be able to tell me why. That's us taking things into our own hands. We are trying to basically become the gods of our own lives. When we see these passages in the Old Testament, we don't see a God who is making decisions based on necessarily his emotions, not based on fear, not based on convenience. It is a God who is holy and just and perfect, and he is working with a human race who is the total opposite of that and beyond. They are totally wicked. They are totally debased. They hate him. They rebel against him. They are not holy. And so he's making decisions based in that realm. It is a totally different discussion, is a totally different topic, totally different realm than human beings making their own decisions because they think that they have the authority to do so. We look at and again, we're not saying that, you should hear this answer and be satisfied necessarily, but we just want to be able to give some sort of biblical standpoint here. We look at the firstborn of the land in Egypt. That didn't just happen willy-nilly, like right there in one single passage. We went through quite some time where God was wrestling with Pharaoh, and he was using Moses, and he was using Aaron as his mouthpiece, and he was going back and forth and back and forth. And that entire period of him going back and forth with Pharaoh was nothing but grace. It was nothing but a loving God giving him the ability to notice his sin, repent, and worship God. The firstborn son was a point in time where Pharaoh had become so hard-hearted, so rebellious, that there was absolutely no going back. He had made it clear that he wanted nothing to do with God. And God kind of finally put his foot down and said, okay, if that's how you want this to go, if you want to be the God here, if you want to be in charge here, these are the consequences for you as a wicked person, you as a wicked people, going against me, a holy, righteous judge. So that's kind of like, in a nutshell, it's a very generalized, nutshell-y kind of explanation of the story. But again, that's God here speaking to a wicked people. It's not just God like, you know what? I'm just not feeling the Egyptians today. I'm feeling like they're kind of not helpful right now. I'm not in a time of my life where I want this to happen. Or maybe even if we get, even more serious than that, we know that abortion happens for more than convenience. But even if we compare those situations to what God's going through, they still are not on the same level. So we have that. And then we also have, the story with the bear and the children. Two things there. First of all, we have to understand the language there. That is not about a mother bear coming out and killing a bunch of kids. The language there says young, but if you were to look into the actual original language there and peel back the layers of the onion, it's really not talking about a child. It's talking about a young man, right? So we're talking about a man who was just younger in age, who was old enough to understand what he was doing. And we also see that this isn't just some stupid group of kids that are making fun of someone for losing his hair. We have to remember that these prophets were representing God himself. They literally were the walking physical authority of God, covered in the Holy Spirit of the God of the universe. And they weren't just mocking a bald man, they were mocking the Spirit of God. And so God was acting again in righteous judgment. Now you might say that, well, how's that righteousness? How can a God call that good or just or whatever? From a biblical standpoint, from a Christian standpoint, we have to understand that God does not owe us anything. Like the fact that we are breathing right here and right now is pure grace. Like that is it. That's the end of the story. That's all there is to it. The fact that we're breathing right now is grace. And so, that's a kind of a hard pill to swallow. I'm not saying that should be something you're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Good answer, Brad. But biblically speaking, I mean, that really is the answer. So anyways, that's emotionally an inadequate answer, but biblically speaking, that is at least a partial answer as to what's going on context-wise. We can't just get mad at God. We have to understand the context of what he's doing and why he's doing it. And then another argument we have is that, these Bible-thumping Christians are trying to take away the women's rights, and they're trying to do all that kind of stuff. And then we get into this topic of, what about rape and what about incest and those kinds of extremely difficult, extremely painful, extremely sad situations. And first of all, if a Christian is any type of Christian, they would say nothing other than the fact that rape and incest is wicked to the core. That is a sad and wicked situation. That is not something to take lightly. That is not something to joke about. That is not something to brush off as some political situation. That's not something that we should just be throwing on the wayside because we want to be able to stand up for our biblical ideology. We need to understand the pain that's involved in that. We need to understand the suffering that's involved in that. But I also want us to understand the scientific facts that are involved with that. So of all the abortions that take place, and you can find this stretched out over several medical journals, several different surveys. The stats pretty much stay the same all the way across the board. Out of all the abortions that are performed, it seems that on average about 25% are due to not wanting a child, and about 25% or so are done so that a woman's sex acts or sexual activity, I guess would be a better way to put it, are kept secret. They don't want this out in the open. They don't want parents or siblings or whatever to know that they're even having sex at the time. Probably based on a lot of fear or poor education. Mm-hmm. So that's about 50%, give or take a few percentage points. So 50% of abortions that happen are out of convenience. And that's just the stats based on people taking surveys and answering, hopefully truthfully. We have out of convenience to some sort, not wanting a child or hiding their sexual activity. Only about 4% were due to health reasons, as far as like the mother's health reasons. Like if she has a child, she could suffer or die. 4% is actually a very, I'd say a very liberal percentage, because more than not, people actually say it's about 1% or less that people are having abortions due to the health reasons of their mom. Only 3% or so are due to fetal issues, meaning if the abortion doesn't take place, that either the child won't make it through childbirth or they'll be born with some sort of defect that's going to affect them for the rest of their life. That's only 3%. And only 1%, most people say even less than 1%, are due to rape. And only 1%, even less than that, are due to incest. According to a 2015 survey just in the state of Florida, incest-based abortions were only 0.001%. out of that entire year's worth of abortions. And so, what the reason I'm saying these stats is the argument would be, okay, what about these horrible situations? And the answer is, well, those are really horrible situations, and we do need to have an answer to that. But we're talking about less than 1% for those two types of situations. And I think we would both be in agreement here that, okay, what do we do about that? Something should be done about those times, because we can't just be okay with rape. We can't just be okay with incest. But we can't also kind of take this huge pro-choice outlook on this topic because of less than 1 or 2%, when 50% or so of the abortions are done for pure convenience. And this is out of the mouth of the people having abortions. Now, I have this quote that I got from an article, and this is obviously a Christian quote. It's from thegospelcoalition.org, and it's a pretty stern quote. I might use the word stern, maybe pretty gutsy, audacious. But it says, when a rape results in a pregnancy, this means that we are now dealing with 3 people instead of 2. 2 of those 3 people are innocent, and 1 of them is guilty. Take a case of violent rape. The pro-choice want to do 2 things. And I'm going to insert the word generally speaking, because this is clear. This is not an every pro-choice person's like this. I'm going to change his word just a little bit there. But the pro-choice want to do 2 things. First, they want to go easy on the guilty one, refusing to execute him, while executing one of the innocent parties for something his father did or her father did. And secondly, they want to make out anyone who objects to this arrangement as the calloused one. So because that's so audacious, I kind of want to break apart what he's saying here. He's saying that when a woman gets raped, there are now 3 parties involved. We have the person that's the rapist, we have the woman, and we now have a child involved. One of those, the rapist, is guilty. The other 2 are innocent. The mother shouldn't have been raped, and the child is innocent. He or she has nothing to do with it. And he's saying that, generally speaking, the pro-choice side, and as much as we hate doing this, from a political standpoint, that typically falls onto the more liberal spectrum of the 2 main parties. He's saying they kind of don't make sense in a certain sense, because they want to fight against the execution of the guilty person, because generally speaking, the left side of the politics spectrum is typically anti-death penalty, right? Because they believe in justice for all. They believe in life as far as that sense goes, because he's outside of the womb. He should have the ability for restoration and be brought back into society and all this kind of stuff. But then in the same breath, they want to go kill this innocent child because of the horrible situation that he or she was conceived in. And so it's kind of not making sense in that manner, because they're both life, and you want to kill the one and save the other, kind of thing. And he's saying that while that's all happening, the people who are pro-life, who object to this deal, who object to this ideology, they're saying that we're calloused because we don't understand the depth and the depravity, I should say, of the situation as far as rape or incest goes. So a pretty audacious quote, but I think it makes sense. I think it's a fairly good argument from a pro-life standpoint. Should you have anything to add to that before? Sorry, I just kicked your mic there.
That's definitely a pretty powerful argument there, too. And I just want to add, as far as, a lot of these arguments, these Old Testament arguments, is, I've always wondered about this stuff. You hear all the stories in the Old Testament, and you wonder, like, what if God is so pro-choice, why would he allow potentially hundreds or thousands of pregnant women to be murdered off in a flood? And Sodom and Gomorrah, there had to have been some children living within those city walls, and probably some pregnant women, and God just destroys that entire city. And I've always wrestled with that, and I've researched why, and not just for the podcast, but even in the past. And I personally feel like I've never heard an answer that I've been able to accept as this is biblical truth and this is why God did it. Not enough to satisfy my want to know the answer to those questions. Hear all kinds of explanations from all sorts of people, pastors, theologians, people who have written pages and pages of explanation, and none of them have ever impressed me or given me that satisfaction of being able to say, yep, that's the answer. But as a Christian, one of the things that I need to do is to be able to just submit to God, whether I like what's happening, whether I agree with what's happening, or whether I understand what's happening. That's just what I have to do as a Christian person. I have to be able to say, I trust you even though I don't understand it. And I don't think that that's wrong for a Christian to do. I think we see that coming from Jesus himself. We see Jesus having moments with his Father while he's here on earth, in the Garden of Gethsemane, right before he's arrested. And he's just praying, and he's stressed out, and he's like stressed to the point of bleeding blood, because he just really doesn't want to have to go through what he's about to go through. I mean, it's knowing the excruciating pain and death that he's about to go through, and he's asking his Father, is there any other way that this could possibly go on without me having to go through this? So we see Jesus himself asking questions of God, but also saying, even though I really don't want to have to do this, it's not about what I want, it's about what you want.
Yeah.
And it's about not my will, but your will be done. I may not want to do this, I may not want to accept this, but I know that you know what's best, even if I don't quite understand it. And I'm not saying that in that moment Jesus didn't understand what he was about to do, or he wasn't accepting what he had to do, but he was still there on his knees, struggling with what he had to do, asking God if it was possible for there to be another way. And the response from God was, no, there isn't. And that's to his own son. And Jesus was willing to just say, all right, I don't want to do it. I don't want to have to go through it, but your will be done.
Yeah.
And that's at this point where I have to fall on some of this Old Testament stuff. You know, I don't understand it. I don't like a lot of the stuff I read in the Old Testament. A lot of it, to be completely transparent, I'm like, man, God is a jerk.
Yeah.
Like, you're telling me that there was no other way to get around this? We're reading through the Old Testament as a church right now, and they're like Leviticus and Exodus and Leviticus, and just almost every day I felt like, man, God is a jerk. But I also am realizing, like, I have to submit to whatever is going on because I don't understand the plan from his perspective, and I don't I don't get it, but I don't have to get it. So that's where I'm falling. I don't have a good answer for the people's questions. Probably people who are listening this, searching this on YouTube, and they're coming across this podcast. I'm a born again, 100% sold out Christian, and I can completely understand where you, as a non-Christian, maybe an atheist, reading the Old Testament and looking at this God, I can completely understand where you're coming from as a Christian. But I just know that I have such confidence in my faith and in God that I'm just trusting that He knew what He was doing, whether I understand it or not. I just have to submit to it, and someday I'm going to know the answer to these questions.
You mentioned that for somebody who's, it's hard for us to say that. So we know that if somebody's not a believer, that's probably sounds absolutely insane to them.
Mm-hmm.
And this next sentence probably will too. If you're not a believer, this might not make sense either. But something that helps me a little bit as well with this misunderstanding, this not understanding, not liking God's plan and the way He's doing things, especially in the Old Testament, is really two things that help me. The first is that in Exodus, and I can't remember the exact chapter, so forgive me, it might be Exodus 20 or 22 or something like that, but maybe even before that. He has the Israelites, they leave Egypt, right? And he has them go through the wilderness after leaving Egypt. Now, they're mumbling and grumbling and complaining that they're going through this wilderness, they're just going to die, we should have just left in Egypt, we should have just kept us in Egypt. But we get the insight as readers nowadays, which they didn't have necessarily, was it says something along the lines of that God didn't take them over the mountains to go through the Philistine nation. Instead, He took them through the wilderness because He knew that if they saw war, that they would basically have weakened hearts, they would give up, and they'd want to go back anyways. They would just totally give up on God. They wouldn't be able to handle the certain situation. And so God took them another route. And in that moment, it felt like that was the dumbest decision. They didn't understand why God was taking the long way, why God was doing things that way instead of what seemed like the better way to them from their human perspective. But God, being who He is, knew in the background, no, you might not see it yet. You might not understand it yet, but what I'm doing actually makes sense in the grand scheme of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
And so that passage kind of gives me a little bit of peace, like just knowing, okay, this sounds absolutely ridiculous when I look at some of these passages. There had to have been a different way. Man, my brain is so finite. My understanding is so finite. It is so weak compared to the knowledge that God has of the entire universe. Like, I am a dot on the timeline. But God sees everything all at once. And so I have to find some sort of rest in that, some sort of peace in that. When it comes to these arguments. And another thing is, we are not talking about a political issue here. We are talking about the God of the universe and a moral, life-based decision. And depending on what astronomer you read or what articles you're reading, stuff like there's this kind of like fact out there, and some people use a grain of sand, some people use a dime, but I've read in a couple places that if you were to take a dime and you were to hold it up like at arm's length to the sky at night, that approximately like 10 million stars are being hidden behind that little tiny dime that you're holding up. And so I have to think to myself, if that's true, if we're even anywhere near that number, we're not talking about some issue that, as Christians, when you say, oh, we just have to submit, like, we're not talking about America here, where we're just going up to the president's house and holding a picket sign. Like, we're talking about the God of the universe, who holds those 10 million times 10 million times 10 million times 10 million stars in the palm of his hands. They're all named by him. They're all intimately known by him. And we're talking about that God and his truth and his morality. And we're going to go picket that because of our feelings. From a Christian standpoint, that just doesn't make sense. From a biblical standpoint, that doesn't make sense. And so that kind of gives me a little peace as well to just know, man, he's so much bigger than me. He's so much bigger than my emotions. He's so much bigger than my fears and my anger and all that kind of stuff. So,
yeah. Just as you were talking there, I'm thinking about, when I was a kid, I loved to connect the dots pictures. Like if you take an empty connect the dots picture just from the beginning, all it looks like is a bunch of mess. It's just dots on a page. And I feel like that's what I'm looking at when I look at why God was doing this in the Old Testament. But I know that as I start connecting some of those dots, eventually, I'm going to be able to start to see somewhat of a picture. And then by the end, I'm going to know the whole picture. But I can't wave around an empty page of just dots that I don't know what the end result is and just argue it. I can't.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
And really that's twofold, because part of it is like real life, like as we get older, as we are spending more time with God, we're going to understand him more, we're going to know him more, right? But then also just within the realm of the Bible, it makes sense, because a lot of times we're hearing these arguments, oh, God is so wicked, he's an idiot, I can't believe him, he did this in the book of Exodus. Okay, so we're looking at one passage in one book of the Bible. There's 66 books in the Bible. Do you know the context that you're reading, or are you just picking out a passage and yelling? Do you understand the context of that passage? Do you understand the context of that book? Okay, now mix that context with the next book and the next book until you have the entire Bible here. Now put that passage inside the context of the entire 66 book in front of you. And look at what God is doing in history. Okay, now try to look at it. Now try to wrestle through it, right? It's going to be a totally different wrestling match than if we just take one little sentence in Exodus, God killed babies. Oh, this doesn't make sense. I can't believe Christians are pro-life and God does this. Okay, that's not how it works. You wouldn't do that with any other book, ever. Historical book, science book, fiction book, it doesn't matter. You wouldn't do that. So we have to look at the entire context of what's going on as well.
Yeah. And again, going back to the connect the dots, I got another image in my head. We could be connecting these dots and say we're connecting dots, and we get to a point where we see a picture of an angry dog with, maybe he's got spikes around his neck and he's showing his teeth and he just looks ticked. So at that point, we're like, well, look, it's a picture of an angry dog. However, not the whole picture isn't finished yet. We don't know why he's an angry dog. Maybe he's just an angry dog. But maybe if we connect the dots and finish the picture, we'll see there's a reason that dog is angry, because maybe he's backed up against the wall. Maybe he's got a shotgun in his face and he's trying to protect himself or whatever. If we don't see the whole picture, we don't know why the dog is angry. And I think that's probably the case with a lot of biblical perspectives. We see God as being an angry God in the Old Testament, but we don't have the whole picture. We don't know the purpose for why he looks that way. Because I don't think we do have the whole picture yet.
All right, so I guess for the sake of time, let's move on a little bit here. So the last part of this episode, if you are not a believer, we ask that you keep listening and hopefully learn a little bit about our perspective, learn about what we believe really Jesus looked like. But the rest of this episode is pretty much coming at the church. This is us having a little sit down with the brothers and sisters, little family intervention.
Mhm.
So we want to talk about, so where should Christians stand on this topic? What should we think? What should we feel? What should we believe when it comes to the topic of abortion? I want to say right off the bat, just guns blazing. If you are a Christian, if you are a follower of Jesus Christ, if you believe that the Bible is true, you should be pro-life. And I said pro-life. You should not just be anti-abortion. You should not be pro-baby. You should be pro-life, this concept of womb to tomb. Do not call yourself, as Christians, do not call yourself pro-life if you're out there saying that the Mexican border should be closed down. Don't call yourself pro-life if you're okay with the way that nursing homes treat the elderly. Don't call yourself pro-life if you think the foster and adoption care system is golden and ready to go and doesn't need reformed. You should, from the time a child is conceived until someone is put in the grave, you should be for their life, right? Another example, don't call yourself pro-life and then be like, yay, death penalty. Don't call yourself pro-life and then say that there's not an issue with race. Don't call yourself pro-life and say that there's not an issue with the prison system. All right? We can do this for quite some time here. Pro-life, womb to tomb, in jail, out of jail, nursing home, out of nursing home. I don't care where it is. You should be pro-life. That is what the gospel calls for. I want to unpack that a little bit, at least to a small degree. Just give you a little sample here. So there's this trend out there, and it's kind of newer to me because I've for a very long time stayed as far away from anything political that I possibly could have. But as I grow and I just want to learn a little bit, and I've stepped into that realm just enough to learn, I've realized that there's this kind of like concept out there. There's this trend out there that there are Christians that separate the gospel into two different gospels. And they have an evangelical theological gospel, which relates to the topic of salvation, where we're worried about doctrine and we're worried about the cross and we're worried about going to heaven instead of hell and all this stuff. We want to go evangelize. And then there's the social gospel, which separates itself from the cross and only looks at the political options. It only looks at what Jesus did as far as justice, how he took care of the social issues of his time, and all this kind of stuff. Now, the problem is that Christians that are in this realm, and there are pro-choice Christians out there. There are a lot of pro-choice Christians out there and a lot of them, not all of them, kind of do this, and they separate the gospels. And they're like, okay, there's a salvific gospel, there's a social gospel, and they try to keep them separate, right? The problem is that people, when they separate it, what happens is, okay, issue X, abortion, might not agree with the Bible as far as salvation is concerned, as far as God's hope for his people is concerned, as far as God's salvific work inside the church is concerned. But I think if Jesus were to encounter this situation and he were to just hear this woman's story or hear this person's story, I think that he would understand. And I think that he would do this. And I think that he would fight for them to have the right to do this because that's just what Jesus would do. He's just such a loving guy, right? Kind of that concept of putting Jesus in the hippie corner. Mm-hmm. But we can't do that, right? You cannot do that. You cannot separate God's righteousness and his justice. Christ is 100% righteous and he is 100% just. You cannot separate that. There is no such thing as a social justice gospel without the gospel of Jesus' righteousness and holiness. He calls us to be both, holy and righteous and just. And when we try to separate the righteousness and the social justice, we often end up with this kind of viewpoint. Now, this comes from an article from 2018. It's called Pro-Choice and Christian, How I Unlearned What My Church Taught Me. That's what this article's called. It's out there, public domain. And when you try to separate the righteousness of God and his justice, this is the ideology that you'll come up with. Abortion isn't this inhumane act that deserves the stigma it has. It's a healthcare service that allows people to live the life they'd like to live. If someone feels like ending their pregnancy is what they need to do, there is no reason why they shouldn't be able to, and no reason why God would look down on them for it. To me, that's a huge issue. That is an absolutely huge issue. It's an anti-biblical viewpoint. What's happening here is this person's opinion, what they're saying is, abortion isn't a biblical issue. It is a human rights issue. And if somebody wants to end their pregnancy, they should be able to do it. And God is so loving and so gracious that he doesn't care what we do with our lives. He's not intimately involved with our lives. You do what you want, when you want, how you want to do it. And God's going to be okay with it. He has no reason to be mad at you. He has no reason to have any concern with this. They should be able to do whatever they want, right? That is you becoming God. That's why we're here in the first place. That's why the cross happened. The cross happened because of this exact situation in our hearts. God doesn't really care about the fruit on the tree of knowledge of good and evil. He would have no reason to really get mad if we just eat this fruit. After all, we do have free will. We should be able to do whatever we want. God's gracious. He's loving. He'll be cool with it, right? Jesus was slaughtered, murdered on the cross for that heart. And here we have people that are using the Bible to still fight for that today in the name of a healthcare service, in the name of choice, in the name of free will. As Christians, we cannot place constitutional rights above the law of God. As a Christian, the second that you choose to follow Christ, you, in a very real sense, forfeit your American rights. When you become a citizen of heaven, you are now separate from the rights of America. That's not saying you can't vote. That's not saying you don't deserve to have the constitutional rights. We're very blessed in our country to have the rights that we have. That is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, when those rights disagree with the laws of heaven, you choose the laws of heaven.
Mm-hmm.
You lose the right to fight for the American Constitution when they are going against the laws of heaven. Life, abortion, jail, death penalty, elderly, adoptions, foster care, life is not a political viewpoint. It is a biblical viewpoint. And that's where Christians need to stand on it. There you go.
I mean, if you take that line of thinking and apply it to what we talked about last week with the woman caught in the act of adultery,
mm-hmm.
Jesus was completely graceful in handling that situation. He did not condemn her. He actually saved her life in that moment, mm-hmm. because she was about to have stones pummeling her to death.
Right.
He became her advocate in that moment and saved her life, literally. However, he did not then pull her aside and say, now, whatever you feel like you want to do, if you want to go back to that life, that's your choice and I'm cool with it. He didn't say that to her. He said, now go live your life of sin. Mm-hmm. I don't condemn you, and there's nobody else here to condemn you. Now go and stop what you're doing.
Yeah. Because
what you're doing is going to get you killed.
Right. You don't get more pro-feminist and pro-life than, than that scene right there,
Yeah. So, yeah, Jesus was not cool with her behavior. He addressed it head on, specifically. He didn't hold anything against her. He didn't condemn her. Didn't tell her that she was going to hell. But he did say, you need to stop. Mm-hmm. You can't do this.
Yeah. And kind of, here's another argument for this pro-choice Christian standpoint. And the people who are Christian and non-Christian would have this argument here, but as we said, we're talking to the church at this point in time in the podcast. But pro-choice Christians, another argument they might have is that as followers of Christ, that we should fight for the rights of women to be free of the rule of the patriarchs, right? The patriarchal society, right? Totally get that. That is absolutely gospel-centered right there. That is something we should fight for. We should fight for women's rights. They should have the right to vote. They should have the right of free will. They should not be raped. They should not be forced to do something they want to do. They should have equal pay. They should have equal power, right? I'm not saying that they shouldn't in any way, shape, or form. That is 100% gospel. But let's be consistent, though, with the gospel. Abortion is not the issue of a woman's right. The baby that is inside that woman might be in her body, but it is not her body. We've talked about this in the science last episode. At conception, it has its own DNA. It's not the mother's DNA, and it's not the father's DNA. It has its own DNA. It's not your DNA. We also get to the point of 6 to 8 weeks. The baby has fingernails. The baby can feel pain. The baby has organs that are beginning to work on its own, right? Not your organs. At 8 weeks old, the baby's liver is getting rid of its own urine. It's not your liver doing that. It's the baby's liver, or kidneys, cleaning out the system, right? So if we're going to be consistent in our gospel viewpoint, again, this comes to being pro-life, not anti-abortion, right? You should be pro-woman. You should be pro-woman in that we are concerned as Christians about her entire well-being, her health, her safety. We should be concerned about not just her physical well-being, but also her mental well-being, her spiritual well-being, her emotional well-being. We should be looking ahead what she's going to go through if she makes this decision. We should not be focused on the political decision that she needs to make or the emotional decision that she might be feeling like she is forced to make in that moment of time. If we really care about the woman, if we really care about life, we're going to think about and care about everything before, after, the whole spectrum of what this decision is going to entail. So if you want to be consistent, Christian, then start being consistent. If you want to be gospel, then start being gospel. But don't pick and choose how you want to use your gospel to start fighting for your political agenda. I'm just gonna say it. That's what it's gonna come down to.
Yeah, and I'll second that. That's another. I wanted to throw that challenge out there to Christians who are listening to this. Is when it comes time to stand before the Lord, He is not going to give a rip about how well you stood for your political opinion. He doesn't. I don't think he really gives a rip right now about what our political opinions are. And I think it's time that we, as Christians, again, I want to stress, if you're a Christian, throw aside your political opinion and actually be pro-life. Does your fight stop when the child is born, or does it then continue to make sure those kids are taken care of once they're out of the womb? Are we making sure that these children aren't born into poverty? But not just the children. We're also called to take care of each other as adults. How often are we passing by people who are in need on the street, who can't afford health care, but we're throwing our hands in the air and we're giving the excuse of, well, those people are just being lazy and they just want to abuse the system. That's not our call to make. We're called to take care of each other, no matter what. Are we supporting the building of a wall to keep people out, or are we going to tear down those walls and extend our hand to those who are in need? We're just reading in Leviticus, and And earlier I was talking about how I was, we're reading through the Old Testament, and there are portions where I feel like I'm really angry because of something God did. But then there's these other points where I'm like, this is awesome because God is giving this directive of, people who are growing food. He's saying, don't pick all of your food because you need to leave some for the foreigners and the aliens for them to come and pick it so that they have stuff to eat. Like,
Right.
we're supposed to welcome foreigners into your land, onto your property, and let them eat your food. Like, what happened to that? Where's the disconnect here to where Christian people are screaming for walls to be built around our country to keep people out?
We have a lot of Christians that leave their Bible at home when they go to the polls.
Yeah. Are we fighting as hard for someone who is about to take their last breath as we are for someone who is about to take their first breath? And I don't think that we are. And as you said, I think that we need to take a good look at ourselves as Christians and make sure that when we say we are pro-life, we are pro-life from womb to tomb. That's all I'll say about that.
At the risk of sounding hypocritical to some people, and I'm not going to speak for Brandon here, but I know for me personally, like, to an extent, I'm talking to myself here too, not just, oh, this is me against the rest of the church. Like, I'm fully aware when it comes to pro-life issues and stuff like this. Like, I'm fully aware that I am a white male in America that makes enough money to live in a house. I was raised by two upper middle class, I would say, white people who took care of me. Like, I did not grow up in poverty. I did not have the issue that a lot of these people have. I was not forced to make these decisions that a lot of people have to make. I'm well aware of that. I'm well aware that that I could be doing more to fight for life in other areas. So I'm well aware of my own flaws. I'm well aware of where I need to go next, and I'm educating myself more and more to do that. So this isn't me against the rest of the church. This is, as a Christian, I'm also preaching to myself right now. I'm reminding myself of what Christ has called me to live like, and where He has called me to put my time, my energy, my money, and any type of influence that I have. So I think that's probably a good bit of railing for now. Positives, church, positives. We want to leave everybody with some ways that we could be pro-life, some ways that we can proactively be part of this conversation in a good way, not just at a poll, not just standing behind or sitting behind a computer screen, not just typing rants on Facebook or anything like that, but how can we proactively walk the walk? So I have a couple things, and then Brandon, jump in as you wish, but first of all, Christians, we need to research. Like, we need to educate ourselves. We need to understand what we're saying before we say it. We need to understand the other side. We need to understand the reality of the pro-choicers. We need to understand not just, okay, that some women get raped, but what are they going through? What are their feelings? What are their thoughts? What are their fears? Knowledge is going to be power here. Know your Bible, right? Like, know your Bible. Understand what the God you worship stands for and what He calls us to stand for. Love well. Learn to love well. Learn how to love biblically. And what does that look like? What does Jesus look like when He's loving other people? And in connection with that, learn how to be patient and gracious, and learn how to be empathetic towards people that are on the pro-choice side, or people that feel like they're forced into this, that it's not even a choice for them. And in connection with being empathetic and gracious, Brandon and I have had this conversation for quite some time. Christian, put your sign down, man. Do not go outside of an abortion clinic with any other agenda other than to hug the woman that you see walk out of that door.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have nothing other than a hug to give or to say, go home.
Mm-hmm.
They just made the absolute hardest, most painful, most emotionally distraught decision of their entire life. It will impact them until they take their last breath. The last thing they need is your hypocritical, pharisaical, ridiculous sign yelling obscenities at them. If you don't plan on hugging them, giving them resources, welcoming them into your church, go home. I don't know if I'm more passionate about anything else right now in regards to this topic other than that kind of stuff.
Can I throw a verse in there in connection with that?
Yeah.
1 John 3:16 through 17 says, we know what real love is because Jesus gave up his life for us, so we ought to give up our lives for our brothers and sisters. If someone has enough money to live well and sees a brother or sister in need but shows no compassion, how can God's love be in that person?
Mm-hmm.
Compassion is what we need to show these people.
Yeah.
Like you said, standing outside of a Planned Parenthood building with signs and screaming murder at these women is showing no compassion. And what this scripture is saying here is that if a believer that shows no compassion to someone in need does not have the love of God in them.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not out there trying to, they say they're trying to show God's love through picketing.
Right.
Scripture says that that's not compassion at all, and that God's love doesn't even exist within them.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned it tonight, we talked about it last week, but the woman caught in adultery, I mean, standing outside of an abortion clinic, in a sense, is a 2019 version of that, right? Instead of picket signs, they had rocks that they were about to murder her with, right? And Jesus verbally throat punched them. So before you go out to any location, before you, not even going to an abortion clinic, before you have a conversation with somebody who's had an abortion or is thinking about having an abortion, before you log on your Facebook page with your anger, why don't you open up your Bible and look at what Jesus would have done versus what the Pharisees would have done and start acting more like Jesus, the compassionate Savior who would have grabbed her swollen, tear-filled face instead of the Pharisee who would have picked up the rock. Mm-hmm. Do you have anything else that you want to add as far as ways that we can...
Just one more thing before we close up here is, these girls, these women are going into abortion clinics. They're going into Planned Parenthood because they're looking for a solution to their problem.
Mm-hmm.
It's not enough for Christians to stand outside Planned Parenthood buildings with signs screaming at women while the people inside Planned Parenthood are giving a solution to their problem. Screaming and waving signs is not a solution to their problem. They're going there looking for help.
Mm-hmm.
And it's only the people inside the building that are offering any kind of help. So before you grab your signs and take your hate to the sidewalks, think about that. Like, what solution am I offering by doing this? Mm-hmm. Because the people inside are actually giving them an option.
Right. I mean, I've personally never had the opportunity to do this myself, but we hear stories about it happening all the time within the church. What would it look like if we actually did go give that other solution? What if we met with this girl, we see go in there, we walk right in with her, sit in the waiting room, before she goes back, we have a conversation with her, and we find out she's getting an abortion because she doesn't have she's a teenager, this was an accident, this was a mistake, her parents are going to disown her, she doesn't have the money, she doesn't have the ability to do this. And what if we say, you know what, why don't you come live with me? I got a spare bedroom in my house. You come live in my spare bedroom. I'm going to make sure you're fed every day. You concentrate on any money you have going towards buying the supplies you need. I'll help what I can. My church will help what I can. You live with me. We're going to walk through this together. I'm going to take you to your appointments. I'm going to help you make decisions. When that baby comes, we can either help you find a place from there. You can stay with us for a little bit, or we can help you with the adoption process. But I'm going to walk this with you, right?
Mm-hmm.
What if the church looked like that?
Yep.
We're offering her a solution that also gives her hope.
Mm-hmm.
Where the clinic is giving her a solution that is going to offer her nothing but pain.
Yep.
Right? I don't hear or read about too many stories of women who have made that decision and walked away pain-free for the rest of their lives and never thought twice about it.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the stories you hear are that they are eaten alive by it day in and day out.
Mm-hmm.
So what would it look like if we offered an actual hopeful solution, man?
Yep.
Go be the church.
As we close, we want to give some suggestions on some alternatives to abortion. And Brad, what you just mentioned there is actually a maternity home situation. I know in our area, I know some people that have a maternity home who have done that very thing, that they've opened up their home. They provide a safe place during the pregnancy. They provide family atmosphere. They connect the woman with resources within the area to help with the pregnancy and learning how to become a mother. They provide transportation to appointments. They provide day programs to teach budgeting, parenting skills, relationship counsel, support and care, and material needs, spiritual needs, etc., at no cost to the woman. So these things do exist. That's definitely a good option to look into. Of course, adoption is the most commonly suggested alternative.
Mm-hmm. And then I want to just kind of list off some organizations that could always use financial help when it comes to being pro-life. So maybe you really aren't in a position to be able to help people. You can't have them in your home or whatever. Maybe you have a little bit of extra money, $5 a month. I don't know. There are things outside of your local church, of course, that could help. And these are pro-life across the board. So some of these are about human trafficking. Some of these are abortions, anti-abortion. Some of these are justice initiatives. But we have the American Center for Law and Justice, Silent No More, the Human Coalition, the American Association of Pro-Life Obstetricians and Gynecologists, Americans United for Life, Feminists for Life, Choose Life Inc., Love Justice International, and the last two I have are actually my two favorite. The Equal Justice Initiative, the EJI, which is an organization that basically gets statistics, but also puts people on the ground dealing with racial inequality, specifically looking at how colored young men are in jail more often than white young men, looking at how broken the prison system is and how these people actually go out and fight for people to get off of death row. They've actually found people to be innocent on death row, and they've gotten them free instead of being executed for something they didn't do. And then the last one, I fell in love when I first found out about this. It's called Embrace Grace. And so it's this organization that is for mothers who have a baby on the way and they don't really know what to do, and they're scared. And this organization usually works with churches, and you basically come together as a church and you come alongside the mother, you throw her a baby shower, you get her all these supplies, you kind of make her feel like a princess for the day. Basically, just this kind of small way of doing a smaller version of the maternity home that you mentioned. But basically, just make her feel loved, make her feel special, and say, man, just here is as much physical love and grace that we can give you. Just here are diapers and wipes and coupons and baby formula and all this kind of stuff. And by the way, what else can we do when the baby comes? So those are just some of the things that it does. But those are some coalitions and organizations that we can, as the church, be part of if you're interested, if you have the financial ability to do so, to be pro-life, not just pro-baby.
Yep. The only other thing that I want to mention, and I'm going to pick on the church just for a minute, because I love all of my church family, but I also want to throw a challenge out like I like to do. I like to challenge the church because I want to see the church grow and get better. But I really believe that any church that's bringing in a decent amount of money should have a program to support women who are thinking about abortion. And what I mean by that is next time you go to church, take a look around at the building. If your church can afford a state-of-the-art sound system with special effects lighting, fog machines. By the way, fog refills are ridiculously expensive. Just a little side note there. Video projectors large enough to project screens onto a drive-in movie theater. If your church looks like this, state-of-the-art facilities, and they don't have some kind of a program in place to help women out of abortions, I would ask your pastor why they have the money to spend on this stuff, but they can't spend money on helping these women through this difficult decision, especially if your church is a pro-life preaching church.
There's actually, this is just one example. There's a church in Texas. I won't name them. Maybe I should, but they're a state-of-the-art kind of church. Big tithes come in and stuff like that. They actually have like mobile homes, like mobile clinics that come in. By the way, Tender Care is another organization I didn't mention, but they bring these like mobile centers where like women can get free ultrasounds in the parking lot. Like in a nice thing. We're not talking like sketchy. We're talking like an actual organization comes, paid for by the church, and gives these women free ultrasounds. They can see their child. They can be taken care of. They get checkups by actual doctors, stuff like that. Really cool stuff. But thanks for staying with us over these 2 episodes. It's been a tough conversation. We appreciate it. We hope that you would dialogue with us. Give us questions, challenge us. But until next time, thanks for listening to In Dispute Podcast.
Thanks for listening to In Dispute Podcast. We hope today's conversation has stirred you to seek biblical truth. If you'd like to contact us with questions, comments, or suggest topics, you can find us on Twitter at Dispute Podcast and on Facebook at facebook.com/InDisputePodcast. Tune in next week for another topic in dispute.